Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh and welcome to finally, the review of the HE-60, the baby Orpheus. We did part one, which was basically an introduction going over all the things that we had to do with it. Part two was where we voted on whether or not to put the black grills on it or keep the original grills and the original headband. It was also going over some preliminary cost things. And then this is going to be part three. We're going to go over the total cost for everything. In terms of how much the actual headphone cost, how much this equipment costs to run this headphone, and how much the extra parts and pieces, pads, grills, and things that we ended up purchasing, how much all that basically ended up costing. But first, there's a lot of people I gotta thank. A lot of people kind of really came together and made this project as awesome as it is. And that first person is of course going to be the owner of this headphone, Israel. He's a good friend of mine and he has been incredibly patient while I figure all of this out. And finally, as of today, finally getting to the review. So thank you very much, Israel. I appreciate it. So I also want to thank the folks over at Hyphen for letting me hold on to this Jade amp as long as I have. I definitely appreciate it. And I also want to thank the folks over at Woo Audio who have been very kind enough to lend me this high-end energizer of theirs. And we'll talk about that, one, in its own video coming soon, and two, a little bit later on in this video, but thank you guys very much. And a very special thank you to all the individuals who helped reach out with either information or they offered parts of their own headphone to go onto this. It's been very, very welcomed, and I'm very thankful for all of you who did reach out. So thank you very much. Okay, so with that being said, thank you very much for watching, and let's go ahead and jump into this review. Okay, so first let's go ahead and go over the costs of this entire project. And I have a couple of different builds. One is going to be the baseline model that we have constructed here with some very nice equipment. And then one is going to be kind of the audio overkill option, which is much more expensive. The HE-60s themselves, which we bought a particularly cheap pair, unfortunately, that we had to very thoroughly clean. That did come with the DACS adapter mod that is currently on here, so we did not have to do that, so I can't calculate that for price. This was $1,500 used, so we're going to start with a baseline of $1,500 for just the HE-60. Then we had the pads that we had to replace because when this showed up, again, not the best. It came with some very aftermarket pads that were not that great and very dirty. These are actually OEM pads, so they are Sennheiser branded pads and surprisingly cheap. They were only about $33 for a pair. And one of the things about these pads, unfortunately, that we found out along the way, as discussed in previous videos, is the HD600 line pads, which this is a very HD600 line looking headphone. Those pads actually don't fit. There's this inner ring around the grills that go in here that has a slightly different size than the pads on the HD600 line. So you do have to buy HE-60 specific pads, unfortunately, but luckily they weren't too expensive, and Israel, the owner of this, actually bought a couple of pairs. And then we had some miscellaneous items like blue tack to keep the grills on. You can actually see that blue in there, and things like a cleaning kit for the actual drivers themselves to clean them off from the heavily abused state that they were in, and just a couple other miscellaneous things that we probably ended up spending an additional $25 on. Then you have the aftermarket grills, which you guys voted for to go with the matte black everything, and we actually were able to salvage this for basically free for us to get the headband and the grills from an HE-660S, but that was due to him already owning the 660S. I did have a couple people reach out to me, thank you very much, but we didn't end up needing to go that route. But I did have a couple people reach out offering their headphone as tribute, basically. But I'm gonna list the cost of that approximately for just the grills and the headband, not the 660S, about $100. Right now, with everything together for just the headphones themselves, they're about $1,658 for just this, not an energizer to actually drive them. And the energizers are where things get a little bit more interesting and far more expensive. So the first one we had here was this Jade 2 energizer, and this is actually for a Jade 2 headphone. And these you can buy just the energizer for about $900. It's not the cheapest electrostat, nor is it the most expensive electrostatic amplifier, but it does sound pretty okay with this headphone. And you can pick this up used for about $700. Now, I don't know if I was gonna spend $700 to $900 on a solid state electrostatic amplifier if I would purchase this one. Most likely not. I think I would look at the DACS energizers. I like those, although the build on this is incredible. But either way, that's what we have, and that was a solid state that this headphone was judged on. And then we have this bad boy. And this is a Woo Audio WES, or WES, second generation. And this is very expensive. This is about $4,500, $4,500. So not cheap. It is the tool that allows us to get as close to a real baby Orpheus as possible, because the Orpheus and the HE-1, of course, are tube energizers, and this is a tube energizer. Now this will get its own video, but some quick notes, just incredible build, very good sound, very tubey, very rich, and it's got a lot of guts behind it. I quite like it. Okay, then we have the two potential DACs, which are used for the two different builds. One is going to be this topping DX7S, and the other one is going to be this iFi IDSD Pro. Both are balanced DACs at very different price points. This topping is about $500, definitely not a cheap one, but very cheap compared to the $2,500 of the iFi IDSD Pro. Now to split this further into tube versus solid state, this DX7S is a solid state DAC, and this iFi IDSD Pro is actually a solid state / tube hybrid. You can switch between how much tubes you want DAC, and that will send basically double tubes through both the DAC and through this, the WES here. So, tubey sound versus solid state sound, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but total costs here. So for the cheaper version with the Jade amp and the topping, we're looking at about $3,058. And the expensive version, the better version of this, the more Orpheus, traditional Orpheus version of this, is about $8,658. So definitely not cheap. All right, guys, so it's time to talk finally about sound. I've put it off for 2 episodes, and now we get to talk about it. I like to try and wrap things up into like a single word or a single phrase, and I really can't think of a single thing that describes this. The closest I've come to is crystalline, clear, almost sterile in its approach, but incredibly informative, and there is so much information in this headphone. It's actually quite impressive in certain ways. It's very, very cool. It's not perfect though. There are actually a lot of missing areas, a lot of flaws with this headphone, but also some very good things. And I want to talk about this in 2 setups. One is going to be the solid state setup with the Jade, and the other one is going to be with that Woo Audio Energizer. So let's start with the Jade here, and let's go ahead and talk about the treble response, because it is kind of fascinating in certain ways. One, the speed. That's going to be like the standout feature. If you were to hear this headphone for the first time, I think the thing you would focus on first is how fast everything sounds. Now, it may not be as fast as certain modern headphones, but it certainly seems like it is. Like I have an HE-1000 SE here that is a very, very fast planar, and this seems almost on par with that in terms of the actual speed capability. It definitely gives me almost HD 800 vibes for the speed of the actual driver, although this seems a little bit more consistent and smoother in the top end and doesn't really seem to have as many peaks and valleys as the 800 does, and certainly not as harsh, although very, very fast, and maybe even faster than that 800. The tamper capabilities are exceptional, especially when it comes to specific types of instruments. And when it comes to those specific types, it is beyond most other things that I have heard, even very modern headphones. Specifically, anything that has a metallic sound to it. Anything metallic has this incredible shine and shimmer and glossiness and shininess to it that is just so engaging. So songs like Lose Yourself to Dance, which has this metallic intro to the song. It's in the very beginning, it's these like, I don't know what they are, chimes, beads, something. They're very metallic sounding though. And on most headphones, that sounds crispy, it sounds good, but there's something about the presentation of the 60 that just has almost this real life approach to it. Like there is no gap between not even the recording. It's almost like there's no gap between your ears and what actually happened when they recorded that. Doesn't seem to be processed in any way. It just seems very clear and see-through, and almost like you're seeing the music for the first time, clear vision for those specific types of sounds. Doesn't go for everything else, but for those metallic instruments, it comes through incredibly clearly, precisely, and that is one of the most impressive aspects about this headphone. And that is something that I think I will forever be comparing every other headphone I hear, is the clarity of those types of sounds and the realistic nature of those types of things. Now, another area of the treble response that is very good is the top end of acoustical instruments like guitars, anything with strings, violins. This is incredibly sweet, and this is definitely its bread and butter. Acoustical recordings, specifically high quality acoustical recordings, are one of the top recommendations of genres or style or instruments that I recommend listening to on this headphone. There are some other genres that I like, and then some other genres that I think this is really, really bad at. And we'll get to all of that. Those instruments, I want to start off with some positives here because we'll get into some negatives, but those instruments and really well recorded live recordings, acoustical recordings, they're beautiful, super good. Okay, so mid-range on this thing is a gamble. I will hear one vocalist that I love, one vocalist that I hate, one vocalist that is one vocalist that I can't stand, and one vocalist that I'm over the moon on. It seems to be versatile and not exactly consistent. Let me give you a couple of examples. So Kaya Victoria, very high singer, very rich singer, sounds to me like a female John Legend. Don't know why, that doesn't make any sense, but I don't know, that's just the vibe I get from her. And then you have somebody like Morgan James and like Adele. They have these higher note capabilities. They can have very shouty vocals. The upper mid-range on here can often, for those vocalists, be a little bit punishing. And instead of sounding full and broad and powerful, they can seem both thin but forced on this headphone and a little bit unpleasant. Now with the Jade amp, there's also not a lot of lower mid-range, so they're not really filling out those vocalists, and I think that's a big issue and a big reason why the upper mid-range seems as punishing as it is. It doesn't really fill out very thoroughly, and it's a bit disappointing there. Okay, and then the bass response, which is going to be kind of the biggest drawback of this headphone for both amps. It's pretty sterile. It's very clear and detailed, but there's not a lot of bass response there, and there's almost no presence, no feeling, no impact, no largeness to it, no real meat behind the bones. You kind of just hear the bass, it's there, but there's not really a strong presence behind it. So relatively disappointing. Well, actually, for the price, very disappointing. So the regions where the bass response is very good is basically anything that can happen naturally. So vocal bass, instrumental bass for the most part, except for your very deepest recorded cellos, and even most of those are very good. But anything that happens naturally within a real instrument, this is gonna actually sound quite complete and quite pleasing with. But when you start getting into more artificial bass, it's not really gonna be the best. And I have a couple examples of each. So some recordings that sound really good are Nightfall, the Nightfall album from Till Bronner, Tillbronner. That whole album is exceptionally well recorded. It's got a lot of bass in it, and this headphone can play those instruments so well. A track that does not sound very good and doesn't have any real power or oomph or guts behind it is Tumbling Lights from The Acid. It's a very good song, it sounds really dry on this headphone and doesn't really seem as lifelike and as rich and thorough as I know it can. And then this is also the same with imaging and soundstage. You know, the Wes here definitely extends the soundstage. It widens this headphone by a fair bit compared to the Jade, but even in its widest, it's not all that impressive. The imaging is exceptional, as you would expect. That's part of one of the things that makes those really finite metallic instruments seem so real. But soundstage, there's nothing really going on beyond the boundary of the actual headphone. It's all up in here, it's all in your head. All right, so now let's talk about this headphone with the Wes here, because this fixes a lot of the issues that the Jade amp kind of has, and it makes the sound very, very good, a lot warmer than it normally sounds. And I actually think that on this headphone, it complements it very, very well. Now, It doesn't fix everything, but it's a big step in the right direction for this. So you win some, you lose some with this amplifier. The treble response is far more pleasing and enjoyable at the cost of a little bit of that finite resolution. At that very top end, those very last few percent of resolution, this does not quite have it to the same way that the Jade has it, but it's a far more pleasing experience, and it's a bit better tempered and more in line with the rest of the music, especially with what that amp does to the bass response and the mid-range, bringing it up and making the whole sound a little bit more consistent rather than kind of an upper mid-range shouty mess that the Jade can often sound like. Metallic instruments are still very good, but there's added warmth, and instead of being as crystalline, I would kind of describe them as a richer treble response. And richness and treble don't really go together, but there's something about the smoothness characteristic that is not necessarily as clear, but more pleasing perhaps. And very, I don't know, it's just got this characteristic that is very, very nice and reminiscent of pretty good headphones on a really good amplifier where it handles the top end without harshness, but everything is very clear. That's what the Wes provides. Okay, so for mid-range, the Wes does a great job of keeping what was great about the mid-range and fixing some of what was not great about the mid-range. So the top end of mid-range gets smoothed out. It gets a little bit dulled down, and for this particular headphone, I think that's a great thing because it makes those vocalists like Kaya Victoria, like I said, Morgan James, Adele, a lot more palatable and not necessarily perfect, but a lot more pleasing and more forgiving for more types of vocalists. You don't have to listen to like a specific type of vocalist like you do with the Jade for it to sound good. And the vocalists that I thought sounded pretty good were people like The Weeknd or Marina or Kaleida sounded very pleasant on it. John Legend, certain Adele recordings, but not most, but just certain ones that were recorded in a specific way that sounded pleasing. Cecile McLaurin-Salvant was very good. A number of people, especially if they had nice recordings, sounded very pleasing on the Jade, but the Wes sounds great with those, probably even better with those recordings actually. But the recordings that were unpleasant, it's now brought that up to a more pleasing and more forgiving area. And a big part of that is the kind of introduction of lower mid-range, and it kind of fills out a lot of the gaps that the Jade had, and it makes this headphone a little bit less sterile in those regions and creates a warmer experience, but not what I would consider to be a warm experience. This is still a very technical and even a little bit cold sounding headphone, even with the introduction of all the tube goodness. And one of my favorite vocal tracks for this headphone is To Be Human by Marina. It's just beautiful, exceptional clarity on this. I really enjoy it. And then the bass response. While the Wes does do more, it still doesn't do enough to anywhere near be what I would expect for as much as this headphone costs. There are headphones that do bass response far, far better. Even a headphone that's not particularly known for being a bassy headphone, the HD-800S, has a lot more bass and a lot clearer bass, better direction, just overall better than this headphone does. Okay, now let's talk about imaging and soundstage on the Wes. So definitely wider, still nothing to write home about, but what you get with the Wes is a little bit more space in between the instruments, but still pretty much all a ball up in here. There's not really much going on outside of that, but it does provide kind of an openness factor in between the sounds. Some people describe it as like the blackness between instruments. It provides a little bit more of that, but still not really what I would come to expect for the price range. But that's not a fault of the Wes, that's a fault of the HE-60. All right, now one possibly impressive part, though not always pleasing, is gonna be the dynamics. This is one of the more dynamic headphones I think I've listened to, mostly in the treble response and the mid-range and not so much in the bass because it doesn't really have a lot of bass to be dynamic with. This thing can go from a whisper to a train wreck like that. Just so quick and just ramps up like no other. Now, one song that actually took me by surprise of how quiet to loud it actually got was Jeff Buckley's Hallelujah. Kind of an underrated song for dynamics because most headphones don't really show it, but there's certain sounds like the S region in that song is a little bit emphasized. certain guitar sounds a little bit later on, I think near the end of the track, where it kind of goes from a kind of a trail off to a very almost sharp but loud guitar stroke. And on this, it was kind of shocking, to be honest. So this has some benefits and some downsides. Benefits being it's a more realistic sound. You know, if you go from somebody talking like this to screaming in your face, that's kind of realistic, right? And some people are searching for that. Me personally, I like to be lied to a little bit. I like a little bit of dynamics, but I don't like anything over the top because honestly, I really value my hearing. I listen at what I try to be a consistent and safe level to where I'm still getting a lot of sound, but it's not over the top. And with a headphone like this, I have to constantly be regulating, going from song to song to song. And this provides a little bit of more of an annoyance to me than anything else. And I wish it was a bit, I don't know, it's impressive, but I just wish it was a bit less just based off of personal preference. Okay, so to wrap all this up, the conclusion to this whole series, based off of performance for cost, is it worth it? No, not even close. Especially for $8,000, like this sounds like a good $500-600 headphone at best. It's not good. As a passion project, as you know, something to experience with, to have the experience, or you know, what we were doing, which is we were trying to learn about this thing. We were trying to experience what it would be like to restore this. So this project was also especially palatable because I didn't end up paying for really any of this myself, and even he is not paying for what would make up the bulk of the cost, which would be like this Woo amplifier or the really nice DACS or this Jade energizer. Like that stuff goes into purchasing an electrostatic headphone. It is something that I would have to consider in the cost, and I just don't think it's worth it on a cost to performance standpoint. But he and I and you know that you're buying a headphone that was made a long time ago at a completely different era, and it's not going to necessarily stack up to today's standards. Now, in some ways, it does stack up. Like the timbre characteristics in the top end, they're so cool. Like it's really neat to be able to hear that, because there are certain sounds, and it's not everything, but there are certain things that you're taken aback by how forward and real, and the placement is like so specific, and it's like structured in stone in your head about the shape of that instrument and the shape of that sound, and it can just provide this ultra realistic placement of certain things. And now if it was everything like that, this would be the most mind-blowing headphone in the world, but it's really limited. So it's a very cool experience for that, but then you get all these other features that are subpar to industry standard as of nowadays, especially like the bass response compared to even a decent planar or even a decent dynamic. This bass response is relatively poor, like with a lot of electrostatic headphones, unfortunately. Now, the West does a great job of kind of assisting that problem, but doesn't fix it, right? It kind of helps it out and pushes it along the way, but it's still nothing that the HE-60 is ever going to be, you know, it's never going to be a bassy headphone. It's never going to be a bass monster. It's never going to be known for that. So if this is something you are interested in, if my recommendation not to do it is not enough, if it is something you are interested in, how do I recommend utilizing it? For specific types of recordings, for specific genres, this headphone is honestly really great. It is, in fact, for certain songs, it is incredible. And for certain songs, it is the best I've ever heard that specific song be played. I don't think that's necessarily worth the cost, because while those specific songs and genres are fantastic, if it's not recorded well, you are really punished for it. And the sound, and I wrote this down in my notes here, and this is kind of a weird way of describing it, but the sound quality coming out of this is almost like there's too much sound and not enough space. And it's almost really busy sounding. And I think part of why the West is so good with this is because it kind of adds that space, adds a little bit of breathing room for the sound. And you can appreciate the sound more than just having what would be an entire field of sound jam-packed into something the size of a walnut and slammed against your ear like that. Like, that's kind of what the sound sounds like. It's just detailed everywhere, but there's no care for presentation. There's no care for pleasantness. And yeah, so it's got some got some room to develop. I'm sure the new HE-1 sounds fantastic and certainly better than this. And this is no point of reference for the HE-1 or even the Orpheus. This is kind of just a fun, you know, made up passion project about the baby Orpheus. So I want to send a huge thank you to all the people who are involved. Woo Audio, Hyphaman, Topping, iFi, even the dude who took trash care of these headphones before this, because you at least allowed us to make a couple additional episodes on resurrecting it, making it a little bit better. And I also want to send a huge shout out to my new editor, Dakota, who is going to be helping me out here, and he should be helping me out making some more content than I would usually be able to make, because as of right now, I pretty much do everything, all the shooting, all the writing, all the listening, all the editing. I'd like to make more content for you guys, and he's gonna help me out with that. So make sure to thank Dakota, all the people involved, and a huge, huge, huge thank you to a good friend of mine, Israel, for lending this to me for so long and being so patient. All right, that's it. Finally, I know I've talked so much. It's a long video. I appreciate you sticking with me, guys. I'll catch you in the next video. Stay safe, wash your hands. You know the drill. Have a good one.